you get these cards in the field called tarjetas, and they're punched for which hour you came in and which hour you left and how many buckets you picked during the course of the day. And as the worker, you get a copy when you leave, and the company gets a copy at the end of the day. Somewhere between field and paycheck, somebody says, oh, look, 10 buckets, $16, minimum wage is $8 an hour. That would mean $16 is worth 2 hours at minimum wage. So my paycheck, which would be a payroll check with Social Security and FICA, like all that stuff taken out, would say I was there for 2 hours instead of 8 or 9. And they did this for every worker that was on my crew. Nobody I worked with could pick 5 buckets an hour, 8 hours a day. The most anybody thought that they could possibly pick every day was 4 buckets a day. And the father of one of the families that I was friends with in the field, the best, so 4 buckets an hour, right, is 32 over the course of an 8-hour day. The most he ever could pick was 34 in a day, and that involved coming to the field like an hour before we were officially starting work, working through lunch, and then injuring his arm so he couldn't work the next day, so it didn't matter that he had made 34 buckets on that day because he picked 0 the next, right? And this is something that is formally accepted in those communities as just the way that it works. And for me, right, as a reporter, I'm like, so if this company, so I'm not working for a grower here, I'm working for a farm labor contractor, and this is a form of labor management that has almost doubled in California since the 70s. So this is where you subcontract out your labor to somebody else. So this is what Foxconn does for Apple. It's what the sweatshops did in China for Nike in the 90s. All that stuff. It's the same basic management where somebody else is responsible for the work conditions. And so, I called up Christopher Ranch and the Garlic Company, which were the companies I was selling to. Christopher Ranch is sold at Whole Foods. The Garlic Company is sold at Walmart, and I have been told that they're also going to begin supplying Trader Joe's. And I called the companies up, and both of them basically said the same thing, which was, well, all of our paperwork says they were paid minimum wage, so we don't know what to tell you. I said, well, I have a paycheck and a tarjeta that don't match. Well, you must be confused about where you were picking. There's a lot of garlic, and you must be wrong about which field you were in. Well, I wrote down the name that was on the crate that was in the field that I was picking in. Well, we don't know what to tell you, right? And so this is their response, so they don't have to worry about it. And then the contractors, the only thing that's fungible for them, because they're competing against each other, right, to get contracts, and the only thing they really have a lot of control over is lowering the wages, right? If they want to increase their profit margin, they can't do anything about the cost of trucks or of gas or of having a building, but they can pay less to workers. And there's so little enforcement and so little threat of enforcement, and the penalties are so small if they do get found breaking the law that they just don't comply, and there's no real danger of that. So, and that's a problem across the country, not just in California. California is actually probably the best state to be a farm worker, and it has the most protections because the UFW's history there means that there are better laws on the books. They don't enforce them very much. But like elsewhere, I mean, it's something like 15 states where farm workers don't even have rights to workers' compensation because they were left out of all the federal minimum wage and overtime protections in the 30s. So everything is pretty piecemeal around the country. So that's been a really interesting thing for me to sort of figure out and be like, oh, interesting, there's just basically no laws. Is what, as a worker, is what it felt like, right? There's nobody looking out for like workers in the fields, really. Yeah.
I'm only partway into the book, but it seems like you do have like quite an advantage as a white, native English speaker. The one woman you meet who keeps thinking you could have such a better job. How did you I know you kept saying like I have a lot of problems, I don't want to talk to people. Did it ever occur to you, or was there like a journalistic reason that you didn't want to make up like some backstory? Like, I don't know, to me, reading it, I was like, if you said something to like these women that they could identify with better, maybe they would understand a little bit more. You were so vague kind of with your answers. Was that something that you felt journalistically you didn't want to like say make too much stuff up about yourself, or how did you do that?
Right, so the question was sort of like, how did I figure out where to draw the line about my backstory and what was I making up and not? And basically, I'm just a really bad liar, and I didn't want to get anything too complicated. And one thing I'll point out, I don't just come from like a working class background. Like, my family was really dysfunctional and messed up when I was growing up. Like, I totally have had like really difficult struggles. My mom was really sick when I was growing up. I did a lot of care for her. I put myself through college. I was estranged from my dad and stepmom for like 5 or 7 years. So it's, and I talked about like I didn't say, well, when I was going to NYU to get my journalism degree, right? But I would say, we had problems in my family growing up. We had problems with violence in my family growing up and things like that. And I was honest with people about my experiences in that way. And actually, the first woman I worked with in the fields in California, Pilar, in the book, like, she and I really connected because she had had problems with violence in her household. Part of this is, in Spanish, I can't really lie. Like, you need to have I have an appreciation now, like, you have to have a real facility with language to be adept enough to lie on your feet, right? And I cannot do that in Spanish. I'm also not a good liar in general, but like, we're sort of like, I can't even say a normal sentence without thinking really hard about it, much less a lie, right? And so I just sort of was pretty honest with folks, and I have to be honest, like, people just don't ask a lot of questions, right? And often, what was interesting, right, is Juan, right, my friend who had done the trip to Texas, I realized after talking to him a bit, like, he was really like, oh, you've had some problems. I get that. And I'm like, oh, he probably thinks I've had, like, substance abuse problems, right? Because that seemed to be from the vibe I was getting from him, is that he didn't have really good impulse control. Like, and he meant well, right, but had impulse control problems. And so it was sort of identifying with me and being like, oh, she got some problems too, right? So I just I'm not really good at lying. And I feel like the more you lie, the more complicated it is ethically. If you just sort of tell people a vague story and they don't ask any more questions, that's a really different thing than like making up a whole different like life for yourself.